All right, now that we've got sign-in failure working, let's get the sign-in success to work as well. Let's first take a look at a mock-up of what we want this to look like when it works. So here's the sign-in page. And after signing in, we want to go to the user profile page like this. So here's Bruce Tiburon. And this is just like any of the other profile mock-ups we've seen before. Like right now, this is not the final profile. This is just our current profile. Let me take a look at it. Go to /user/1. Right, so we've already got almost all these elements in the mock-up. What we're going to change, though, is the links. So let's close this down. So you see here at the top, I've got home profile help sign out rather than home help sign in. And this is the kind of change we want to be able to make based on user sign-in status. So our first step in getting that to work is kind of a cheat. We're going to punt the actual sign-in to something deeper in our application. So what I'm going to do here is say, well, what we want to do is sign in the user and then redirect to the user show page. Remember, we can we could do user path like this, but we can omit that user path part, just say redirect to user. And now the reason I didn't write a test for this is because of course this sign in function doesn't exist yet. So I said before that we were going to be concentrating on the create action, which we are, and then I said we'd be focusing on the else branch, and we are, but we've just cheated by punting it to this sign in function. So we need to write something that will sign in a user, and that's really the task of this section, and this is where the real heavy lifting in this lesson is. Our sessions controller spec, and under describe post create, let's add a new describe block, and we're going to say describe success, and then we should say what success is going to consist of. So I'll get rid of this for now. We want a before each block because we want some attributes that correspond to a successful sign in. So let's do that. So first, let's make a user that will sign in. So let's call it @user. And just to remind you, go to the users controller spec. We can create a user with this simple factory code, just @user equals factory of user with the user symbol. So let's do that. And now I want an attributes hash that has this user's email and password. So let's do this. @attr equals email is @user.email, and password is @user.password. By the way, this thing here, this @user.password, wouldn't actually have the password value if this were a user created in the ordinary way and then retrieved from the database. But factory users, just to remind you, let's see where it is. It's in spec factories.rb. You can see that we actually do assign a password here. So this sets that virtual attribute that defined by attra accessor here at the top here. Yeah. So the factory sets this attra accessor in this line right here. So that means that we can use the factory user to sign in. And so what does success mean? Well, it should sign the user in. We don't really know what this does yet, but we know what we want to do. We're going to post to the create action, and the session will be @attr, and then we need to fill this in. And then, of course, we want to redirect to the user's show page. So, it should redirect. And so that's post. Response should redirect to, and remember inside of our spec we have to do user path of, in this case it's going to be @user. So remember, we can do redirect to user here, but inside of the spec we do have to use the user path named route. Okay, so we should be red now. Even though we have the redirect here, what's happening when we actually call this is that it hits the sign-in user line first when it does this post create, and that doesn't do anything. I mean, there is no sign-in function, so we have to write it. Now, at this point, we need to make a decision about how we're going to sign users in. On some websites, you sign in once per browser session. You'll sign in, and then if you close down your browser and go back to the site, it'll make you sign in again. Another model, though, is to remember the sign-in. And, of course, some websites have a little checkbox that you check. But we're going to use a simpler model that has no checkbox. It's just going to say, if you sign in, then you're going to stay signed in effectively forever. And we'll see shortly in this lesson what forever means in practice. But what it means is essentially that if you sign in and close your browser down and come back to the site, you'll still be signed in. This is not a particularly good model for like a financial website or a stock trading website, but for something like this, our sample application, we're not dealing with super secure data. Let me fix this typo here. All right, so let's take a look at how we're going to do this. There's some tricky stuff here. We're going to start with a module for the session functions we're going to write, and as it so happens, we could make our own module, but as it so happens, there is already a module that we can use for this purpose. There's a sessions helper module that comes with the sessions controller that we generated. And so what we're going to do is put the sign-in function that we have here. We're going to put the sign-in function in the sessions helper, and that's going to do the actual sign-in. So let's put it in here. Remember, when calling a function, you don't need to put the parentheses on. You actually don't need to in the definition either, but I just can't stand leaving the parentheses off. And so now we have to figure out, what are we going to do? How are we going to sign in this user? And it used to be you had to do quite a lot of work to get this to go through. In fact, if you look at the Ruby on Rails 2.3 tutorial book, it will show you all the hoops you have to jump through. But there's a common pattern that's emerged on the web, and Rails has implemented it and made it super easy. So what we're going to do is we're going to use what's called a permanent cookie, and it's going to be secure using a method in Rails called signed. And so this is really just going to be a one-liner. And here's the one line. It's just cookies.permanent.signed. And we can treat this as if it were a hash by giving it a key corresponding to the name of the thing we're storing. So let's just call it a remember token. And then this cookies.permanent.signed takes a 2-element array as an argument. So let's first give it the user ID. The first element has to be the unique ID of the user that we'll use to retrieve the user from the database. And then there needs to be some string that identifies the user in a secure way. That is to say, a string that cookies.permanent.signed can use to encrypt the user ID and place it on the user's browser. And if you think about it, we have such a string already. It's in the user model. Actually, we need to annotate the model. Let's go here. Okay, now that we've re-annotated the user, we can see that we've got this salt here. And recall that the salt is made using this secure hash method using the time when the user was created and the user's password. So that means that we can use this salt in order to encrypt this remember token. Now, it's okay if you wouldn't have guessed this. Like, I wouldn't have guessed this. I don't really understand how this works. But I read plenty of Ruby on Rails blogs, and at some point one of these popped up on the blog of one of the Rails core team members, and I saw it and said, hey, well, I can put this in the tutorial because this solves one of the most common problems on the web, which is how do you remember people's sign-in status. In fact, if you'd like to see all the hoops you used to have to jump through to get the functionality in this one line, take a look at the Ruby on Rails 2.3 tutorial, which effectively builds a custom version of cookies.permanent.signed. What's important to know is that this line is putting a remember token on the user's browser in a way that's secure. So this sets the cookie, but it doesn't actually do the sign-in. In order to do that, what we're going to do is introduce what will turn out to be a method called current_user, which I'll usually just read as current user. So I'm going to set the current user equal to the user that is in the argument of the function. So to make this a little clearer, I just want to show you a couple snippets of code that represent how you used to do this before this cookies.permanent.sign. So let me paste this in. I'll be deleting it momentarily. You can also find this in the book, of course. I mean, not all of this material is in the book, but this particular code is. So what you used to do is set a cookie with a particular key. Now, this might look familiar. This looks just like a hash assignment. It looks like cookies is a hash, and we're setting the hash with key remember token equal to this value, which is itself another hash. This is the usual nested hash pattern that we find a lot in Rails. In this case, there's a value, which is the user ID, and the expires key. And now this is a pretty slick Rails helper. It's a time helper that tells you how far in the future 20.years.from now is, and then in coordinated universal time, UTC. We can actually look at the console and see how that works. So you can see 20 years from now is in 2030. And so that expiry is essentially what it means to be set forever on the web. 20 years apparently is forever. And in fact, this permanent method being called on cookies is effectively what sets this expiry to 20 years from now. So that's what this guy does. So this, I think, is a little clearer, this like explicit assigning to the cookies hash, but it's a lot more cumbersome. Like this one line does a whole lot of work. And if you look at the Rails 2.3 tutorial, it's amazing how much of that material gets collapsed down into this one line. So I should mention that, of course, this isn't really a hash because somehow it writes to the user's actual browser. If you're familiar with cookies, you'll know what this does. We'll see in a few minutes exactly what this does by looking at the cookies on my browser. But one of the nice things about the way Rails handles cookies is it gives you this abstract container, this abstraction layer that doesn't require you to know how to write stuff on a user's browser. It takes care of that for you. You can just treat this like a hash. And the way this works is that once you set the remember token, you can find the user by the token. And in fact, the way you would do it is user.find by ID, because we use the user.id here. You find by ID and then cookies of remember token. So this is what we're going to be doing, and we can omit this explicit assignment because of this cookies.permanent.sign. The signed part is what makes it safe to put a user's ID on the browser. So there's a security concern here. If you just put someone's ID on the browser, then you could potentially log in as any user just by faking what the cookie is. But in this case, we're signing it with this salt. So essentially, that's what's happening. Is that it's being encrypted so that you can't just reverse engineer this thing. You can't just sign in as anybody. If that seems a little confusing, go ahead and read about this in the book, which goes into more detail on this particular topic. All right, at this point, we need to define the current user, and we actually can write a test here. So I'm going to fill this in. This is the kind of stuff that it would be very surprising if you could guess at this point, but I'm going to put it in, and we'll see how it works. Inside of a test, you can access the controller using the variable controller. And the reason we need this is because the current user is going to be attached to the controller. And we want the current user to be equal to @user. So this dot should, if we've signed in, then whatever this current user is, it should equal, double equals, the user. And I'm going to put a second line here. I'm going to say controller dot should be signed in. And I'm going to let you think about that second one while we work on it. But you should be able to guess something important about a method we're about to add. I shouldn't say you should be able. You might be able to guess it. It's a little tricky. Okay, but the first step here is to define the current user method, or rather define a way to assign to the current user. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say def current user equals sign. Now this is a little bit strange. A lot of computer languages don't support this kind of construction, but what we're defining here is actually a method called current user equals, and it takes an argument, which is a user, and what it does is it sets an instance variable, which we'll call @current user, equal to that user. So this is what's known as a setter method. You may recall that we used this Atra accessor here for the password. This creates setter methods and getter methods. So this one line creates the equivalent of a password equals method. And here we're actually defining it explicitly. We actually could do this without doing it explicitly like this, but the setter method sort of goes hand in glove with the getter method, and the getter method can't just return the instance variable. So naively, you might guess that the getter method might return current user. And the reason this won't work is because the whole point of all of this sign-in machinery is to remember who the user is as we move from page to page. But this @current user is just an instance variable. So if we were to set current user, will be red here. If we were to set current user and then click on another page, why aren't we red? I'm surprised. I guess it didn't run it with the module. So what I was saying though is that as we move from page to page, every time we click on a new link, all of the instance variables on the server's version of Ruby are being reset. Like they only exist for one request. So what we need is a way to persist this from request to request, and we've already done that. That's what the cookie does. So what we should do here is either return the current user, or we should return the user that we find from the remember token. And so I'm just going to put in the or syntax there, the double vertical bars, and then I'm just going to punt this over to another method, user from remember token. And I'm going to make this a private method. We actually don't need this anywhere outside of this module. And so I'm going to define this, user from remember token. And what we're going to do here, this is a little tricky. I told you we were going to throw down a lot of code here. We're going to add a class method to the user model that's going to be called authenticate with salt. And it's going to take in two values. It's going to take in this little array. What we're going to do is we're going to use this salt to pull out the user from the database. And in order to pass, so essentially what we're going to do is we're going to pass this two-element array in as arguments here. So actually, let's do the next thing. We're going to define a remember token. So the remember token is just going to be cookies dot signed remember token. Remember, this signed thing is new in I believe this is new in Rails 3, and what it's going to do is it's going to make sure that we're not leaving unencrypted things on the user's browser. So cookies dot signed, or if this is non-nil, then I just want to return it, or I want to return a two-element array that's nil, 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 in order to match this pattern. And so I'm going to say user.authenticate with salt remember token. So I'm going to authenticate this user with the salt, and I'm going to pass it the remember token. But you can't actually pass in just this array. What you want to do is pass in two arguments. So let's see how that's going to work. Remember this class less than self. Anything in here is automatically a class method. So let's do authenticate with salt. And it's going to take a user ID, and then the second argument is the salt. And I'm going to say cookie underscore salt just to make sure that we don't confuse this with the user salt. We could actually use the variable salt here. Since this is a class method, salt isn't already defined. So remember, down here, when we say salt here, this is just a regular method inside of the user class. So in this context, this is the attribute corresponding to that user. So this is the user salt. In this class method, there is no user. It's just, this is within the class. So we could actually call this salt, but I think this is a little clearer, saying this is the salt that comes from the cookie. And so the way we authenticate this user is that we first pull out the user corresponding to this ID, and then we make sure that that user's salt, in fact, matches the salt that's stored in the cookie. So let's do that. I'm going to say find by ID. Remember, this returns nil if there is no such user. We don't. If you just said find, it would raise an exception, but we don't want to raise an exception because it's okay that maybe this isn't a valid sign-in. And now there's a lot of trickiness going on in this section. You may want to watch it a few times and read this section in the book. Now I'm going to say if the user isn't nil, which is user, and the user salt matches the cookie salt, so user.salt equals cookie salt. In that case, I'm going to return the user, else I'm going to return nil. This construction where there's a Boolean, this is either true or false, then a question mark, then one return value, colon, another return value, is known as what's called a ternary operator. And it's a very nice one-line way of saying return the user if the user exists, that is to say if the user isn't nil, and if the user salt matches the cookie salt, else return nil. And you'll note that if you think about this, if you look at this authenticate method, there's a way to rewrite this using the ternary operator. In fact, it's left as an exercise in the book. But since we're here, why don't we actually do that refactoring? We have a green test suite. We're not actually testing authenticate with salt in the user spec because we're going to be testing it as part of the sessions machinery. So let's refactor this though. User is find by email, and we can use the same construction here. Remember, nil is false in a Boolean context. So if user is nil, then this will be false. So we want user and user.hasPassword, submitted password, question mark, user, else nil. So let's see if we're still green. This is the same construction as we've just used with authenticate with salt. Remember, we wrote those good tests for the user spec right down here. This authenticate method. So we've refactored it and we're still green. So we're pretty confident that this refactoring actually works. So this is the solution to one of the book exercises right here. And so this is pretty advanced stuff. If you haven't seen this before, it might be a little confusing, but I hope that seeing the parallel structure here will at least get you in the right groove to understand it. In any case, we now have authenticate with salt, and so what we're doing here is we're sort of pushing things onto a stack. This is the data structure where you push things on and then you pop them off from the top. So we keep pushing things on. So we're pretty deep in the stack now. We've pushed several things on. So now we're going to start popping off. We've got authenticate with salt. Let's go back to sessions helper. So that was user.authenticate with salt of remember token, but now this won't work because authenticate with salt takes two arguments. It doesn't take one argument that's a two-element array like this up here. And so there's a way to do this. It's a little tricky. You can put a star in front of this in order to make this function call work. So let me show you this in the console. Let's say I say def foo accepts two arguments, which are of course called bar and baz, and let's just add them. Actually, let's use the plus operator. We don't know what they are. Bar plus baz. Here we go. And so now, suppose you were to call foo of 1 and 2. It's just 3. And now what if we did foo of 1, comma 2? Right, that doesn't work. Argument error, wrong number of arguments, because it's expecting two arguments, and this only counts as one argument, this array. But if we were to add the star, what this does effectively is just unwraps one layer of square brackets. And so star of this thing is just what's inside it. So let's take a look at this. And so you can see that worked. So what we're doing here, when we call user.authenticate with salt on star remember token, is we're unwrapping this user.id, user.salt. And so in the user model, then, we have an ID and a salt, and then we use the ID to pull out the user, and then we make sure that the user salt matches the salt that's stored in the cookie. Okay, so that's popping another thing off the stack. Now we're back up to current user, which is where we're using user from remember token. And there's a bit of a subtlety here, which is that we want this at current user variable, we want it to persist within a particular request. What that means is if we call current user, we'll be using this current user for lots of things. We're going to be using it for, we'll redirect to the current user, we'll be calling methods on it, and so on. And so we might be accessing it more than one time, say twice in a single view. And yet we don't want to be hitting the database multiple times. And so what we're going to do is use a trick here. We're going to use this funky construction called or equals. And what this will do is it will say if at current user is nil, that is to say if it's undefined. Remember, instance variables are nil until they're defined. If at current user is nil, then what this will do is assign it user from remember token, which hits the database with this authenticate with salt. But the second time it gets requested, this thing is true, and it will just return it directly. It won't hit the database. And so let's see how that works. This is pretty funky syntax. So suppose x is equal to 2. I just want to show you how this works. We've got x equals 2. Now, Ruby has what's called the plus equals operator. A lot of languages support this, and so if we say plus equals 3, this is equal to 5. Right? Now, suppose that we have a user, and let's call it current user to be very explicit. Okay, so we're nil at first because this is just an undefined instance variable. Now, suppose we were to say at current user equals at current user or user.find 1. So what happened there is that at current user is false, and so when it evaluates false or, and then it evaluates this, and remember, anything that isn't nil or false is true in a Boolean context. So what it does is it assigns at current user this user.find of 1. And so now let's do it a second time, though. The OR operator is what's known as a short circuit operator, because as soon as any one thing in a chain of ORs is true, it's guaranteed that the whole thing is true, and so you don't have to evaluate anything to the right of it. And so in particular, what this should do is not hit the database the second time, and I'm going to prove that by putting in an ID that doesn't exist. So this would raise an exception if it hit the database, but it didn't, because what happened here is it just assigned at current user the value it already had. So this is true, and so this whole expression evaluates just as at current user. So this is a little tricky, but this is extremely common idiomatic Rails code. In fact, this is idiomatic Ruby code. So I know I'm throwing a lot at you right now if you haven't done a lot of Ruby programming, but this is the kind of thing you will see all the time in other people's code. And so let me just bring the argument to a close. Notice that x plus equals 3 can also be written as x equals x plus 3. So x is now 5. This should be 8. And so based on this analogy, x plus equals 3 is the same, so this guy, x plus equals 3 is the same as x equals x plus 3, which means that at current user equals at current user or user.find. Well, or is the same as plus in this context in terms of the analogy. So we can write this as at current user or equals user.find 17 in this case. And so this will also work because it doesn't hit the database. And just to prove that it really would raise an exception, let's do this. And so here we have active record, record not found. Okay, so that's a lot of verbiage for this one line, but this one line is very useful because now this returns the current user, and if we use the current user variable more than once in a particular request, then it won't hit the database multiple times. So let's see what's next. All right, we're almost done. Now we're gonna go to this sessions controller spec, and notice that when I say controller.should be signed in, remember the Boolean convention in our spec. If I am calling be signed in, what that means is there should be a signed in question mark method in the controller, which in this case is just in the sessions helper module. So let's add a signed in Boolean. How might we define this signed in Boolean method? Well, when is it the case that someone is signed in? It's when the current user is not nil. Because remember, the current user by default is just at current user. I mean, if user from remember token doesn't pull anyone out, then it's just this whole thing will be nil. So current user will be nil if no one's signed in, and so what that means is that if you're not current user dot nil, then this should return true when a user is signed in. And so we'll use this signed in method inside of our application to test if the user is signed in. And so, for example, we'll use this to change the links in the layout. We'll say if signed in, do one thing, else do something else. But as is often the case, writing the test told us which kind of method might be useful. So this is really nice to say a controller should be signed in. So let's save everything and let's see what our test suite is doing. I have no idea. I'd be shocked. I mean, it can't be green. It's got to be red. Yeah. So this is a good point here. Undefined method sign in for sessions controller. Now, the reason this is happening is because by default, these helpers are available only in views. They are not available in the controllers by default. But we do want these to be available in the controller. In particular, we want to be able to say signed in. We want to be able to use current user and so on. And in fact, we want to be able to say controller.should be signed in the test. And the way to do that is to include the module into the controller. And now we could include it into this sessions controller, but we'll want to be able to test if people are signed in, and we'll want to be able to access the current user in lots of controllers, probably in all the controllers. So the way we can do that, remember this inheritance from application controller lets us do that. So if we go into application controller, we can just include sessions helper. Now let's see if we're green. Look at that, we're green. So we may not understand everything we did here, but apparently the current user is equal to @user. So remember, see what we're doing here. We're posting to the create method. Or the create action, right here, and then we're authenticating it using the authenticate method. And so apparently, this sign in function is now working, because in fact it's true that upon posting valid user sign-in data corresponding to this factory user, the current user is equal to @user, is equal to the factory user, and the controller is signed in. So we'll get a better sense of what all of these methods do as we use it in the application code. But it's really gratifying that we've already got a passing test suite. So this is actually working now. So even though we haven't really applied the current user method, and we also haven't used signed in, we have gotten a working sign-in function here. And so that means we have a working session creation from this create. So let's make a commit.